You are prolific in your work on the resurrection of Jesus, reasons to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. There's something that everyone's been talking about lately. It's the Shroud of Turin.
This was a cloth that is allegedly the burial cloth of Jesus, and it has the image of a crucified figure in it. You can see all kinds of blood marks. You can see teeth through it, and that's because it was like an X-ray.
How do we explain the fact that this man gets crucified by the Romans and then people claim to see him after he died?
I understand why some people, given the evidence before them, still choose not to believe it.
The degree of skepticism and the criteria that you put forward in order to accept that Jesus rose from the dead, apply that same burden of proof to your own worldview and see how it comes out. How did the universe come into existence out of nothing? Why does it appear that it was laid out with life in mind and that it was designed? What do you do with human consciousness? Even atheist philosophers of mind are willing to say, we really don't have any answers for that.
If the resurrection was so central, why would Jesus only have appeared to a few?
Well, I'd say that...
Dr. Mike Licona, welcome to Maybe God.
Hey, thanks, Eric. Good to be with you.
Thank you for being here. I'm really excited to talk to you. We'll get into the resurrection and the evidence for the resurrection, which is it's really what you do best. But first, there's something that everyone's been talking about lately. It's the Shroud of Turin. And I'm just really curious. I've heard you say a little bit about it, but I'd love to flesh it out a little bit more. What are we talking about when we talk about this Shroud of Turin? And what is so amazing or compelling that keeps people talking about it?
Well, the Shroud, Eric, has been around for some time, a long time. It was around in the 13th century. We know that. We later got after the advent of photography, the first photograph of it, Segunda Pia. So it was really interesting. This was a cloth that is allegedly the burial cloth of Jesus, and it's I don't know, maybe 14 feet long, and it was though it's draped over the front and the back of his body, and it has the image of a crucified figure in it. He's got nails through his hands. He's got blood around where a crown of thorns would have been. You can see all kinds of blood marks where he would have been scourged. A lot of interesting things. So what was really interesting when they took that photograph of it, because the image isn't necessarily like extremely recognizable when you look at it, because it's quite faded over the years or millennia.
Yeah.
So, but when they took the photograph of it, the image really stood out because it is actually, the shroud is like a negative. Now, I don't know if you may be old enough. You're in your 40s. I'm almost 65 here, and I remember the days when you had cameras with film in them.
Oh, yeah.
And you would take pictures, and then you'd take the film to a Walmart or Costco or someplace, and a drugstore, and they'd develop it for you, and it would come back. You'd have the photographs, and then you'd have the negatives, which were the opposite. So, if it were white, in reality, it would be black in the negative. If it were black in reality, it would be white in the negative.
Right.
Well, the Shroud of Turin is a negative of this figure. So that's pretty interesting.
How would that happen? Hey there, if you're enjoying this conversation and you want to see more thoughtful, evidence-driven content like this, be sure to subscribe to Maybe God and turn on those notifications. We're always bringing in experts from all sides to explore life's biggest questions. So you don't want to miss what's coming next. And if you've got big questions or ideas of your own for future episodes of Maybe God, be sure to drop those in the comments as well. I love hearing from you. Thank you again for watching. Now, let's get back to my interview with Dr. Mike Licona.
Well, in 1978, I believe it was, the Catholic Church authorized a group of scientists who had a team. It was called STIRP, the Shroud of Turin Research Project. And they allowed these scientists to examine the shroud carefully. The scientists went in, thought they were going to look at it for a couple of days and discover it was just a medieval forgery and close shop, and that's the end of it.
Yeah.
End of the story. But when they finished their investigation, they had no idea how the image got there. In fact, they said, this is not a painting. We don't know. We don't even have the technology today to put it on there. They also saw that, there was post-mortem blood flow. The person in the shroud was in a state of rigor mortis, where your body can go back into the position it was in when the person died, if it was a violent death.
Yeah.
You can see from the pressure points on it that the knees are bent. One foot is over the other, which would be like, it would have been if they put a nail through both feet. The hands are like in front because they would have been tied together, okay?
Yeah.
But what's interesting, you only see 4 fingers. And the reason being, they now know that if you put a nail through your wrist there, which I know the Gospels say hands, but in Greek the word hair would include the wrist. And if you put a nail there, the thumb goes in.
Oh.
So, I mean, who would have known this in medieval times, to do the forgery? Also, the fingers are really, really long, and that, is this guy an alien in here? Is this a mistake? But no, if it's like an X-ray, the fingers would actually look a lot longer. You can see in more recent years, maybe a decade or so, that you can see the teeth through it, and that's because it was like an X-ray. They have found pollen around the head that belongs to the crown of thorn plant that would have been there. They have, and that only blossoms, has this pollen in Jerusalem around the time that Jesus would have died in April. They've also found, and how do you do that if you're doing a forgery?
Yeah.
They found dirt on the bottom of the guy's feet that would have been like what you have in the caves, the tombs in Jerusalem. So there's a lot of interesting, it's a three-dimensional. It's a three-dimensional figure on it. Now, it's not paint, because paint would have seeped through down in the threads. When you look at a thread, you can see lots of tiny micro threads in there. Well, it only goes down like 3 micro threads. So what it is a scorch mark.
Wow.
So the only real challenge that has come to it over the years was 10 years later, they did a carbon-14 dating test on it. The Catholic Church allowed it. And so the scientists debated, well, whatever we do the C14 testing on, it's going to destroy that part of the shroud.
Yeah.
And so, we can't get it back once we test it. So where are we going to do it? So the first candidate is going to be on the very edges, right, where there's no image.
Sure.
The problem is a lot of the people pushed back, scientists pushed back, because they said, well, there'd been a lot of polymers and bacteria that had formed, because back in the Middle Ages, every year they'd bring the shroud out and do a public display of it, and people would hold it. So that would cause a problem. Anyway, there are numerous problems. The physicist who invented C14 dating testing was an atheist physicist, and he said you got to have, I think it was 7 different entities, that independent testers of this, in order for this to be a credible conclusion. The Catholic Church agreed to that, but at the last moment they said, no, we're only going to do 3. And the guy said, well, then it's not going to be a credible test. You're not going to get credible, convincing, or results that you can have much confidence in. They went ahead with it anyway, and they arrived at a date, I think it was like somewhere between 12 something and 13 something.
Right.
And so they declared that it was a forgery. Well, more recently, in the last 2 decades, and so other things have come out. So one of the little pieces that was tasked to be used in the C14, a little square, wasn't subjected to the test, and so a chemist did some testing on it and said, No, this thing is much older than that, and published in peer-reviewed journal article. Okay, you had another textile expert say, yeah, this is the kind of weave that they would have used back in the first century. It would have been common for something like that. Then, and by the way, the number one critic of the C14 testing was the atheist physicist who invented the test.
Yeah.
And he said, you can't have any confidence in the results. Well, later on, they discovered that the three entities that tested it all came up with different dates, and they were not within the margin of error of one another.
Wow.
And so what they did, deceptively, they just averaged the three together. Now, Barry Schwartz was the official photographer on the STURP team. He was a Jewish agnostic. He died just 2 or 3 years ago. And David Beck, a philosophy professor, and myself, we served as editors, co-editors for a Festschrift for Gary Habermas, Raised on the Third Day as the title of it. And I invited Barry to write an essay in it. And he said he'd like to do one on the carbon-14 dating testing. So I said, okay. And it was absolutely devastating to the results of that test. And I remember, now, I've not shared this with too many, but Barry died, like I said, 2-3 years ago. And when I invited him, I'll tell you a little about that conversation. I said, now, Barry, you're a Jewish agnostic. I'm just curious. I've heard that you believe that the shroud is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus. And he says, well, Mike, we can never be sure, but I kind of tend to lean that way. I do think it probably is. And I said, so do you have any idea how the image got on the shroud? He said, we don't know how it got on there. It baffles us. And he said, could be radiation, a burst of radiation that put the scorch there. I said, do you think that this would be pretty good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? He said, yeah, I do think so. And I said, Barry, why are you an agnostic? Why don't you become a Christian? He said, Mike, it just doesn't interest me. So what do you mean? He said, it just doesn't interest me whether Jesus rose from the dead. I said, well, shouldn't it? and he said, well, maybe, but it just doesn't interest me. Yeah. But here you had a Jewish agnostic, a photographer who actually worked on the shroud, who knew the scientist who worked on it. He didn't buy into the C14 testing, showed all kinds of problems with it, and thought that it was probably the burial cloth of Jesus. That says a lot, I think.
Fascinating.
And again, his essay is in the book Raised on the Third Day. It's an amazing essay.
Yeah. Wow.
So
I'm blown
away. The
away.
thing about the shroud is, if it is authentic in terms of being the burial cloth of Jesus, then Eric, we have a photograph of the resurrection.
Unreal. And it would seem like there's several fascinating facts, but the one that is most mysterious is how that image was imprinted on that shroud. It must be related to light or radiation to create that negative result. Is that the going theory, that it was a burst of light or
that is a theory. I mean, that's the one, of course, that Christians are going to put forward, and it certainly is a plausible explanation. If it was just a flash radiation that would scorch the shroud, you know, that is certainly plausible and a way to do it. But
and who holds it now? Who has it?
Catholic Church, and it's in the town of Turin, Italy.
Yeah.
So
okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow. And your friend, that Barry, that said it doesn't interest him whether it's true or not. I want to dig into that in a moment, because I think that's a lot of people's reaction. A lot of skeptics and unbelievers. It's not that they're entirely opposed to the idea of resurrection. It's just they don't really understand why it matters to them. Before I let you answer that question, let's tie up this conversation on the shroud. How strong a piece of evidence do you feel it is, again, as a historian and theologian of record on all events related to the resurrection of Jesus, how strong a piece of evidence are we talking about here?
Well, and, you know, I'm a historian, so the shroud, for me, is an interesting artifact. I tend to think that it is the authentic burial cloth
Really?
of Jesus because we have, I mean, there's so many different things, elements that seem to suggest that it is, and there are no plausible natural explanations on how that image got on the cloth.
Yeah.
But I am a historian, and even though it's an interesting artifact, it's not really my lane. So yeah, I think it probably is, but I'm not an expert on it.
It's not the magic bullet, to answer all questions and quiet all doubts about the resurrection of Jesus, but it is a fascinating clue. And it would make sense historically that shroud, that burial cloth, would have been preserved by the Christians whose lives were altered by this man Jesus, and the cloths are mentioned in the gospel accounts as being, sitting there in the tomb on Resurrection Day. And so why even mention those cloths unless they had become important relics to the church? I don't know. My brain's spinning now.
There's one other thing, Eric, it just came to mind. There's another cloth called the Sudarian, and it is a face cloth. Okay, it would have gone over the head.
Yeah.
Well, it has it doesn't have any image on it, but it does have blood and bodily fluids on it. And when you match it up against the head of the shroud, the blood and the fluids match what's on the shroud. Wow. So it seems that these two did belong together, but the Sudarian doesn't have the face on it.
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting?
That is so interesting.
So it could be that the shroud was, that's what was around Jesus, and then the Sudarian was wrapped around the head.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. For people watching and listening that might be thinking I teed this question up because I'm personally interested or all in on the shroud, I'm not. I genuinely haven't looked into it much at all. I'm kind of a skeptic at heart, and I just chalked it up to sort of wishful thinking mythology stuff. That's not that uncommon in religions, and I never really gave it a second thought. You've given me a second thought today, this moment, regarding the Shroud of Turin. That is really, really interesting, and I'm grateful. Let's move on from that just to get to the heart of why we had you come on, Mike, because you are prolific in your work on the resurrection of Jesus, reasons to believe in the resurrection of Jesus. You've written several books that I've read, and at least in part, the case for the resurrection of Jesus I've read, the one you wrote with Habermas. And then you also wrote a longer, more academic book, The Resurrection of Jesus, which I confess, I've only read in part, but because I don't have that attention span, but they're both fascinating. Your website, for everybody that wants to see the rest of your work, is risenjesus.com, risenjesus.com. I hope everybody will check that out. Tell us, before we talk about the actual reasons to believe in the resurrection, tell us what you would say to someone who's of a similar mindset as your friend Barry. Because again, this is what I hear a lot. It's like, even if the resurrection's true, what difference does it make to me? What would you say to somebody who starts there?
Well, I'd say that one's worldview is going to be the most important decision that they're ever going to make in their life, at least if God exists and if he requires us to believe something that is at least essentially accurate concerning him.
Yeah.
If Islam is true, then we should want to become Muslims. Even if we don't like what we see in that religion, we should still fear God and want to become Muslims if it's true. If Mormonism is true, the same could be said. The same thing about Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity. We want to know the truth on this, and we may only get one chance to get it right. If Hinduism or Buddhism is correct with their reincarnation, we're going to get many opportunities to get it right. But let's say if Islam is correct, or Christianity, we only get one chance at this. And so I want to take it real seriously. Another thing is, the world can be a real brutal place. And like I've got a friend in Pakistan. He's a pastor, he's an apologist, really a brave brother in Christ, and does a lot of really, really good work, rescues women who have been abducted and raped and into a forced marriage with an older Muslim man. He and his wife take care of these people. So But here's the thing. That there are many women in Pakistan, women and children, who are abducted and forced into sex slavery, into a life of that. They don't have their own lives. And if God does not exist, then there's no one to hear their cries. Injustice will go unanswered, goodness will go unrewarded, and death is final. So, but there's really good news, and that is God loved the world so much that he gave his only son, that if anyone believes in him, they will never perish but will have eternal life. And that's really, really good news if it's true.
Yep.
And the only way we can know if that's true is evidence.
Yeah.
So while Jesus was on earth, he made some really radical claims. He claimed to be God's uniquely divine son who was sent to inaugurate his kingdom. He claimed to have the authority to forgive sins, resulting in salvation. He claimed that he was the only way to God. And so when you make these kinds of claims, your critics are going to ask you for some evidence, some signs. And he says, I'll give you a sign, my resurrection. So if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then he was a false prophet whom no rational person should follow. Yeah. But if he did rise, well, that gives us something very serious to think about.
Right. Amen. I've heard you say that you are a Christian because of the evidence for the resurrection. Like that is your reason for becoming, that was your reason for becoming a Christian. I have a very similar.
No, it's the reason I've remained a Christian.
The reason you remained a Christian.
I became a Christian at age 10 because the gospel sounded right to me.
Got it.
But when I doubted my faith, and as I have on many occasions over the years, it's the resurrection that has kept me grounded in him.
Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, that's true. And I have a very similar experience. It's the resurrection is the linchpin for me to this day, even when I have doubts to this day about what's going on in the world or with the church or with me. Going back to the empty tomb is what it's all about. So just tell us about what led you at first to start investigating the truth claim of the resurrection.
Well, I was in my final semester of grad school back in the fall of 1985. I was studying a Master of Arts in New Testament Studies. I was taking every course I could to learn Greek, and I was just passionate about being able to read the New Testament in its original language. And then one day, that final semester, I just asked myself, is this really true? Now, I hadn't really learned anything at that point that caused me to question. I was praying an hour to 2 hours a day. I was reading scripture several hours a day in my work on the original language, and I was just loving it. I felt connected with God. It's just, I thought, do people of other religions feel connected to God? They must.
Right.
Mormons who come to your door, they say they know it's true. They've read the Book of Mormon, they've prayed and asked God, and they have this burning in the bosom. So, I've heard people say, if you want to know Christianity is true, read the Gospel of John, pray, and God will show you that it's true.
Yeah.
What's the difference? Well, I started questioning, and my roommate said, you ought to go see Gary Habermas. He's a philosophy professor and a Christian apologist. And so I knocked on the guy's door one day. I'd never met him. And I told him my roommate referred me to him. He says, come on in and sit down. And I expressed the doubts I was having, the questions, and he just took maybe 20 minutes, shared with me a sketch of the evidence for the resurrection. I left the office feeling reassured about my faith. But later on, I started to question again, and he pointed me to the resurrection. And every time I'd question, he pointed me to the resurrection of Jesus. And then we decided I started lecturing on it at one point, and then I asked him if he'd be interested in co-authoring a book on it. So we did come out with that book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, as a result. And toward the end of writing that book, I said, Gary, you have compiled the bibliography of well over 2,000 sources written on the resurrection since 1975. Now that's about 5,000. And I said, you know what these scholars are saying? They're all looking at the same data. How is it that they're arriving at different conclusions? Who are these scholars?
Yeah.
And he said, well, almost all of them are New Testament scholars. You got a few philosophers. I said, well, do you have any professional historians who have been trained in the area of historical investigation? He said, you might have a handful, but they haven't done anything, real serious or extensive on it. And I thought, I want to do that. That interests me. So that got me involved in doing a PhD, doctoral research, and focusing on that. And during that period, Eric, I engaged in multiple debates with some of the leading critics in the world. Bart Ehrman, the most influential skeptical New Testament scholar in the world, Elaine Pagels at Princeton, Dale Martin at Yale, Shabir Ali, the leading Muslim debater in the world, at least at that time. I wanted to test the argument that I was giving to see if it could withstand the toughest critical scrutiny. I had my own biases too, so I recognized that I had blind spots, but I also know that they had blind spots, but we had different blind spots. So if there were holes in my argument, they could point it out. So that's what got me interested in it, and I just never looked back.
Yeah. And what might surprise some people about your approach to this topic is your commitment to historical analysis and trying to put those biases, those religious biases aside. Talk about your approach as a historian to an event like the resurrection? Because some might say a supernatural event falls outside the bounds of natural historical analysis. How do you square that circle?
Yeah, that's a common objection. So I give an analogy, an illustration. Let's say that astronomers have spotted a comet and determined that it's on a collision course with the moon. And on the day that they've predicted, you've got these space telescopes that are zoomed in on the moon's surface. And at that time that they thought, the comet slams into the moon. And as the lunar dust settles, there's a message written on the moon's surface, and it says, Jesus is Lord. And it's written in Hebrew and in Greek. Now, a good astronomer, a good scientist is going to say this: wow, that's an extraordinary event. It seems like it would require God. I have no natural explanations for it, but as a scientist, I also have no tools at my disposal to be able to identify God as the cause. So I'm just going to have to, as a scientist, I may believe God did it, but as a scientist, my scientific conclusion is that the event occurred, and I'm going to have to leave the cause of the event undetermined.
Yeah.
Here's what a bad scientist, a bad astronomer would do. Wow, that's an extraordinary event. It would seem to require God as the cause. And I have no plausible naturalistic explanations to account for it. However, also as a scientist, I have no tools at my disposal to be able to identify God as the cause. So I can't acknowledge the occurrence of the event itself. That sounds ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what some of these skeptical scholars, their approach when it comes to the resurrection. You look at the data, you compare hypotheses to see which one best explains the data, and the resurrection hypothesis by far explains the data better than any other competing hypothesis. So that seems to suggest that the resurrection of Jesus actually occurred. What a historian can do is say, Jesus rose from the dead, and leave the cause of the event undetermined.
Right, yeah. I remember in your debate with Dr. Ehrman, he seemed to be doing something similar to what you're describing, which is, I think his phrase was supernatural resurrection, or I think it was just miracles writ large. Miracles are the least plausible explanation and thus require the highest standard of evidence, or something to that.
Yeah, he said miracles, by their very definition, are the least probable explanation. Historians must choose the most probable explanation, so they can never choose the resurrection hypothesis.
Right.
Well, I would push back on that and say, Least probable explanation, least probable in reference to what? Because if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, then it becomes the most probable explanation.
Yeah.
100%, right? But if we're going to be responsible historians, then we should neither presuppose or assume God's existence, but neither should we a priori exclude it. I think we need to be open to where the evidence points.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we allow our philosophical convictions to umpire, and the danger of that is manifest. Bad philosophy corrupts good history.
There's a quote. And in so many of these conversations, it's just the Christians that get called out for presupposing. And Christians should be careful in these kinds of conversations about bringing in our presuppositions, especially in conversations around historical and conversations around events like this with skeptics involved, because they don't share those presuppositions. But anyone can presuppose and err in their historical analysis based on their presuppositions of choice. And I appreciate you calling out all sides in that regard. Let's get into the evidence that led you or convinced you of the resurrection and the work you've built your life on now. Give us the case, the facts that most historians agree on for the death and, I guess, the resurrection of Jesus too. What are the facts of the matter for those who might be new to this conversation?
Okay, so I'll just give a few facts, and then if you want, we can unpack how scholars arrive at those as facts, if you want. Virtually all agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. Virtually all agree that shortly after Jesus' death, a number of his followers, his disciples, had experiences they were persuaded were appearances of the risen Jesus to them. You also have virtually all who studied the subject will say that a skeptic, a persecutor of the church, Paul, had an experience he likewise believed was the risen Jesus appearing to him. And it radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. A significant majority of scholars, but not virtually all, but a significant majority acknowledges that some of those experiences of the disciples occurred in group settings. In other words, entire groups simultaneously saw the risen, what they perceived was the risen Jesus. So those would be some facts that virtually all would agree on, except for the one, which is the group. And then there's James. Virtually all who comment on it, I should say, or a significant majority, around 90% of those who comment on whether the appearance to James reported in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 7, whether that changed him from being a skeptic to a believer, but not many. Maybe back in when I did, I think there were only 29 scholars who had commented on it, so I didn't include it.
Okay.
So I wanted something that lots of scholars, a heterogeneous consensus of scholars, virtual, universal consensus. That's what I was looking for. Yeah,
Christian and non-Christian alike agree on this set of facts generally. His death at the hands of Pontius Pilate. Did you mention the burial? I'm not sure if I missed that.
I did not mention the burial because that doesn't enjoy the same. I think there's good evidence for a proper burial by Joseph of Arimathea, but that doesn't enjoy the majority. Or significant majority.
Sure. That's fair. I appreciate that. That shows your own commitment to this standard of historicity. Even so, I can hear people now in the comments going, but even if that's the case, the source material for these claims is biased at its core. It's the Gospels and it's the writings of Paul. What do you say to that kind of pushback that we have to rely on this eyewitness from these eyewitnesses who were men with their own presuppositions?
Well, I'd say, they were biased. We're all biased. So is the person saying that. If you're going to discount a report because the person or the source is biased, does that mean an African American could not report about the civil rights movement or write a history of the civil rights movement? Could a Jewish historian, would they be disqualified for writing on the Holocaust? Would an atheist like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, would they be disqualified for commenting on the existence of God?
Right.
Because they're biased. I mean, Gerrit Ludemann was an atheist New Testament scholar, and in his 2004 book on the resurrection of Jesus, he referred back to his 1994 book on the resurrection in agreement with it, and he said, look, I wrote then that the objective of that book was to convince people that Jesus did not rise from the dead and that they should live accordingly. You have Richard Dawkins said in his book, The God Delusion, if this book works as I intend, religious readers who put it up will be atheists when they put it down. So does that mean we shouldn't believe any of their arguments?
Yeah.
Of course not.
Good point.
What we do have, you say, well, how do we know that they really believed it then? Okay. Because we weren't there. We can't get into their head.
Sure.
I would say you look at their actions. So the same question could be asked, how do we know that Antony loved Cleopatra? Well, we know that he loved Cleopatra because he was part of the triumvirate ruling. You had Lepidus and Antony and Octavian, who became Augustus later on. And the three of them were ruling Rome together. Antony loved Cleopatra so much, he was spending all of his life down in Egypt and neglecting everything he was responsible to do for Rome. When the Battle of Actium occurred, a naval battle where he was going to, later on, when he was going against Octavian, Cleopatra left the battle on a ship, and he wanted to be with her. So he left the battle to be with her, and in the end, it costed him the war and his life. So we know by his actions that he loved Cleopatra. Same thing with the disciples. They were willing to suffer continuously and willing to die for their gospel proclamation that Jesus had been raised from the dead and appeared to them. Liars make poor martyrs. So we can know that these guys not only proclaimed the death and resurrection of Jesus, they actually believed it. It doesn't mean he rose and appeared to them, but it does mean that they truly believed that he had.
And some of these historians you've mentioned that have their anti-Christian presuppositions, like Gerrit Ludemann, who wrote the book you mentioned in 2004 and 1994, saying his goal was to disprove the resurrection so that we would all live accordingly. He's the same guy. I remember that name, and I looked it up. He's the same guy that said it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which he appeared to them as the risen Christ.
That's right. Yep.
So that's the sort of squishiness you see in these academic treatments of the resurrection, even from non-Christian sources like this historian Ludemann. Fascinating.
Yeah, like Ludemann there. And like I said, virtually all historians who study this, including agnostics and atheists and Jewish historians of Jesus, they're all willing to acknowledge that the disciples truly believed that Jesus had risen and had appeared to them.
Okay. So what would they say are the alternative hypotheses or explanations given these facts that you've outlined?
Well, the number one, I mean, there's a lot of them they're no longer said. Like, for example, Jesus survived crucifixion.
Yeah.
No one's really going with that anymore. Legend doesn't work. Even you might say, some will say, well, the resurrection narratives in the Gospels are largely based on legend. But the report that Jesus had been raised and appeared, they still acknowledge that actually happened. But so that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to his disciples and others, that's not legend. And when we know it's coming from the apostles themselves at a very early time, so it's not a legend that developed over time.
Yeah.
You could accuse them of lying, but the fact that they're all willing to suffer and willing to die for that shows that they truly believed it. So it's not a lie. It's not a legend. It's not, what was the other one? Oh, Jesus did not survive crucifixion. Yeah. The number one alternative hypothesis when one is offered today is hallucinations. Sometimes that's stated as visions. And at first look, that seems plausible. Lots of people, multiple studies have revealed that 50% of people who are grieving the loss of a loved one claim to have experienced that person after that person had died.
Yeah.
Now, only 14% say that they experienced them visually. In other words, they saw that person. Only 14%. Moreover, when it comes to the disciples, you don't have 14%, you have 100%. And then, moreover, you've got group appearances. Well, hallucinations are private occurrences in the mind of an individual. They have no external reality.
Yeah.
So, Eric, they're like a dream. I couldn't wake up my wife in the middle of the night and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Maui. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. You can't do that, right? She might dream she's in Maui. I might go back to sleep, dream I'm in Maui, but we're not having the same dream. We're not talking, if we talk to one another, it's not the same conversation.
Yeah.
And then you've got 3 group appearances in the earliest tradition in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 7. So, and then you got Paul. Paul isn't grieving Jesus' death. He believed Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet. So Jesus would have been the last person in the universe Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see.
Sure.
So that's it for the alternative hypotheses. Because of that, the tendency today is for scholars to say historians can't investigate miracle claims, which tells you how poorly the alternative hypotheses have turned out.
Yeah, it's like just kicking over the checkers board when you're losing or something and walking away, That's weak. But I would probably do the same thing if I was backed into a corner like they seem to be around these facts and how to make sense of them. If what you're left with is the mass hallucination theory, that's less plausible than the resurrection in some ways. And so that is a fascinating twist in our modern conversation that we're having.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I'm glad I'm not in that position. But I suppose, for a lot of Christians, if we were in that position, they just say, well, you got to have faith. I mean, that's the position Mormons are in, actually, because you've got so much evidence against Mormonism to show that Mormonism is false. And so they have to, we've actually had Mormon missionaries tell me that the church says you have to believe in spite of the facts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's like, no, count me out.
Right. You're saying if that was the proposition Christianity presented you with, you wouldn't be a Christian today.
That's correct.
Okay. What about the flip side of that argument? If there was someone else who claimed to be resurrected and had the same level of evidence somehow, hypothetically, right? That we have with Jesus's resurrection, would you be inclined to believe it?
Yeah, that is a fair question. I've asked myself something similar to that, Eric, and I don't know the answer to it. So I've asked, let's say the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus, the quality, quantity, everything together, the case we have, the strength of it is X, okay? And then let's say I think Islam is one of the most easily refuted religions in the world. So let's say the evidence for Islam is N. Okay.
Okay.
What if the evidence were switched? What if the strength of the case for the resurrection and the truth of Christianity was N, and the strength for the truth of Islam was X?
Yeah.
Would it be enough? I mean, I don't like Islam. I just find it a very unattractive religion.
Yeah.
But if the evidence, the case for the truth of Islam was X, would I become a Muslim? Would it be enough to persuade me to become a Muslim? And I don't know the evidence for that. But that allows me to understand why some skeptics don't buy the case for the resurrection. They just don't like Christianity.
That's right. That's it. And that's a fair point, and I think that is something every skeptic right now watching needs to hear from a couple of Christian guys like us is I understand why some people, given the evidence before them, still choose not to believe it. And a lot of times it comes down to personal experience, some negative, painful past experience they've had, or just a desire to stay in control in their own life, whatever it is, but they just don't like the idea evidence aside, and yeah, if all the evidence was in favor of Islam, would I become a Muslim? I don't know. But I do know this, and I think you've said it as well. If the resurrection were somehow hypothetically proven false, I would not be a Christian. Like, I'm not a Christian because of where I was raised, or, it's nice, or it feels like familiar, like I'm at home in it. I'm a Christian because Jesus rose. That's what I believe. Mm-hmm. And if he didn't rise, then I would not be a Christian, because I will not live a lie. Mm-hmm. And I think I heard you say the same thing earlier. And I just think a lot of people assume we're only Christians because of when and where we grew up.
Yeah, and that's probably true of some people. Mm-hmm. But sure. Then there are those like us that say, no, if Christianity is false, count me out. In fact, Paul said that,
yep,
right?
That's right.
He said, if Christ is not raised, the dead aren't raised. If the dead aren't raised, let's eat and drink, for tomorrow we die.
Yep.
I mean, that's Paul saying that.
Yeah, our preaching is futile, and so is your faith. Yeah, that's right. And to me, that rings true, as true today as it did the first day I believed in the resurrection. So yeah, wow. Well, thank you, Mike, for sharing all of that with us. And people that are watching, and if you all have questions, I hope you'll pose them in the comments, and I'd love to address those. How early, you mentioned it was early on in the Christian story, but how early exactly did the resurrection take such center stage, where to the extent that if you believed in the resurrection, you were a Christian, you were saved, versus anything else in the Bible? Why not hold Noah and the ark to the same standard, or the 6-day creation, or whatever else is in the Bible? Why did that, and when did that take center stage for us?
Okay, so if I'm hearing you correctly, you're kind of asking two questions. How early is the proclamation,
yes,
Christ is risen?
Yeah.
And then second, how early was it that you got to believe the resurrection to be a Christian?
Okay. I asked it as one question, and I'm still not sure how they're parsed out, but I trust you to take that and run with it.
Well, maybe you didn't mean both.
Well, I do mean both, but I just don't know how they're different.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, well, because some, they say Christ is raised, but when you come to Romans 10:9, of course, if you confess with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Yeah. So it puts the resurrection in there pretty clearly. You have to believe that Jesus was raised from the dead in order to be a Christian. Mm-hmm. Did you have to believe the virgin birth in order to be a Christian? I don't know that there's there's nothing in the New Testament that said you had to believe that in order to be a Christian. Yeah. Do you have to believe, I don't know, it's like, what do you have to believe to be a Christian? What is the essential gospel message? Resurrection is certainly part of that. Yeah. How early did that come? Well, I would seem to think that it's right there at the very beginning, but as a historian, how early can I actually place that? And I'd say, now I haven't really thought of this before, Eric, so I'm just operating off the cuff on this one. But whenever Romans was written, and that would have been in the 50s, well, that would have certainly been the very latest in which it could have happened. So it would have been within 25 years, let's say, of the crucifixion, no later than 25 years, and probably far, far earlier. Yeah. Now, in terms of the resurrection, when did that start to be proclaimed? I mean, everybody seems to acknowledge, all scholars seem to acknowledge it was just almost immediately. Yep. But, if you're going to say, well, what do we have here? Well, you got 1 Corinthians 15, and Paul says, I delivered to you what I also received, and he mentions the resurrection in that. Well, he delivered it to them around the year 51 when he established the church in Corinth, and he received it before then. So that's within 20 years at the very latest, and he's getting this almost certainly from the apostles. He would have probably heard about it from Peter when he met with him 3 years after his conversion experience. His conversion experience would have probably been 1 to 3 years after the crucifixion. So we're talking probably no later than 6 years after Jesus died. And of course, Peter would have been preaching that even before then. Right. So, I mean, it's back to the eyewitnesses, and all the reports have them proclaiming it immediately after the resurrection. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Interesting. If you were to take off your historian hat and put on just a regular guy hat, and consider this question that I hear a lot, which is, if the resurrection was so central from the very start of the church, why would Jesus only have appeared to a few people? Or, I know it was more than a few, but just to his inner circle. Why not to Pontius Pilate or to Caesar or to, the leaders of Jerusalem? How do you make sense of that question?
It's a fair question. All I can say is, 2 weeks ago, my wife and I celebrated our 39th wedding anniversary, and we dated for a year and a half before that. So we've been living together for 39 years and then hung out for another year and a half before. So we've known one another for over 40 years. And she still does things, Eric, that confuses me. And if I don't understand why my wife thinks and does things in certain ways at times after living with her all those 4 decades, I shouldn't be surprised when I don't understand why God does things the way he does at times. He doesn't consult me. All humor aside, though, he may have his reasons. Look at, if the story is correct about the guard at the tomb, they would have seen Jesus. They would have known about the resurrection. I don't know if they saw Jesus. They saw the angels. They would have known about the resurrection, and yet they were willing to lie about it.
Yeah.
Now, to me, to be honest with you, I found that story almost impossible for many years until I ran into 3 friends that I had a friendship with of several years. They didn't even know one another. And all 3 of them, I asked them on different occasions, if you knew for a fact that Christianity is true and Christ is raised, would you become a Christian? And they said no. Matt Dillahunty, a guy that I debated several years ago, he's a prominent atheist. I saw that he was asked on the Beer and Bible Consortium on Facebook. It's a group. And someone put the question, if you knew for sure Christianity is true, would you become a Christian? And Matt said no. One of those 3 friends, he believed that Jesus rose from the dead, that Christianity is true, and he still didn't become a Christian because he said he wanted to run his own life. And I said, he had the same name as me, first name. And I said, Mike, but if that's true, you know what it means? He says, yeah, it means I'm probably going to go to hell.
Wow.
He says, but I'm willing to do that in order to live my life the way I'm living it now. I know that sounds irrational.
I know.
But that's the reality of where some folks are. So why didn't he appear to Caesar and Pilate? We don't know if it would have done any good.
Yeah.
We don't know that. And
maybe he did.
Why waste the time?
Yeah, maybe he did. We never know. We weren't there, but yeah, even if he didn't, why waste the time? Or his ways are his ways, and one day we might understand, maybe not, but it's above our pay grade. And the real question is why he would appear to anyone. I think that's the more operative question. What does it say about him that he did what he did according to what we believe is true as Christians, and the facts that you've stated earlier, that why would Jesus come at all? Why would he lay down his life for us? Why would he promise to come back on the 3rd day and then do just that and appear to those he appeared to? I think that's the better question. What does it say about a God who would do that for us? And I think if we're honest, it says it's a God worthy of our worship.
Amen.
I run into the same kind of people, Mike, and others don't believe me when I tell them the stories. Like, there are people who would choose hell over heaven, paradise, with a God over them, because they're out there, and I try to love them and pray for them, but I think that attitude that sentiment is real. Do you still have moments, Mike, where you doubt about the conclusions you've come to? Do you still think sometimes you could be wrong? And if so, what do you get hung up on? And
I do, Eric. There are times when I do. And honestly, I think that will happen on and off until the very time that I die. It's just my personality. It's the way I'm wired. It's not just my faith that sometimes I question. It's everything.
Yeah.
My wife doesn't even like to go shopping with me for that reason, because sometimes it takes me forever to make just a stupid decision between something. I have come to understand, though, that it's not an intellectual objection, it's an emotional one. And I'll share what I mean by that with something that I know that you can relate to. You are a pastor in a fairly large church, and so I've not been to your church, so I don't know what your stage, the platform up there is like, but I do speak at a number of large churches, and a lot of times the media person will say, you see those pieces of tape to your left, your right, the front and the back, don't go outside that because the lights won't shine on you. Now, that still gives me a lot of room to walk on the stage, and I do like to move around on the stage. So, maybe I've got 30, 40 feet from one end to the other where I can walk and still be within that light. Maybe I've got 10 feet, 15 feet from front to back that I can walk. I mean, I could do cartwheels. I could walk backward, blindfolded, and always stay within that margin. But if you took something that was like 10 feet, a plank that was 10 feet wide, and suspended it between two skyscrapers 500 feet above the ground and say, Mike, I want you to walk from one skyscraper to the next. Not doing it. But Mike, you could do it. Yeah, I know I could do it, but I'm not going to. Well, why not? Well, I could fall. But Mike, you said you could do cartwheels. You could jog backward blindfolded and you'd be fine to do it. So what's the deal? Well, I know, but what if I fall? But you're not going to. You're very capable of just keep your eyes open and walk from one end to the other. I'm not going to do it. Why? Because if I were to fall, the consequences are so horrible that I'm not even going to attempt it. And that's the same kind, I mean, it's irrational.
Yeah.
But it's the same kind of thing that leads me to have occasional doubt. Well, Mike, you've looked at the evidence for the resurrection. You've had, at this point, 38 public debates. You've written on the topic. You've talked to the strongest minds in the world on this and seen that their explanations come up short. What more do you want? I know, but what if I'm wrong? It could cost me eternity.
Yeah.
It's irrational, but it's an emotional objection.
Sure.
And Eric, that's the kind of thing that occasionally keeps me awake at night.
Yeah. I still have my struggles too. A lot of it has to do with things other than the resurrection. But the resurrection keeps me anchored. And it was the resurrection really that woke me up. And many of our viewers know this, I was lost for a lot of years, pretending to be found and pretending like the Christians were the really lost ones. And I thought I had it all figured out. But I just thought I was too smart to believe in the resurrection. And I was buying into other theories about Jesus's death and resurrection, that like the pagan copycat theory that, other legendary figures, mythological figures had died and resurrected on the third day before. And the Christians just wanted to perpetuate Jesus or venerate him as one of their gods, like the other people in the pagan world were doing. And so they superimposed things like his death and resurrection over his story as a way of lifting him up. And, once I saw how fabricated that theory is and what a lie, what a myth that myth is, it is, it's something you can't unsee. And I really saw my own foolishness. And the way that it happened was this, Mike. I was 34 in the Holy Land for the first time. Keep in mind, I was really stubborn and convinced that most of the Bible was unreliable. I still liked the parts that agree with me, of course. I was a liberal political animal at that point, and so anything that fit my social justice agenda, I liked, but most of it I just thought was hogwash. And the resurrection was part of that. And I was in Capernaum, and we got to go down into that house church in Capernaum that has the big spaceship-looking church on top of it now. And we got to go down in the ruins, and our guide showed us the writings on the wall in that house church. I don't know if you've ever seen them, but it's fascinating.
I didn't see the writings. They didn't allow us to go down.
Yeah, it's a special thing that we got to do. Most tour groups don't get to do it. But anyway, some of those writings date to the first half of the first century.
Wow.
So it's earlier than 50 AD, and they're venerating Jesus, calling him God and Lord and worshiping him. And I realized at that point, because in my head I thought, well, the New Testament was written at the earliest, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s AD. And this worship of Jesus, who everyone knew was dead by crucifixion, died a criminal's death, was happening among Jewish people who I knew their first rule was don't worship anyone but God, don't worship a man, certainly not a dead man. Who died under the curse, according to Deuteronomy 21, 23. All of those things were running through my head. And then I realized these devout Jewish small-town people were worshiping a man the world knew was dead. And they were subsequent to that willing to die for their belief. And it was so outlandish what they were claiming that they had experienced him after he died the most awful death imaginable, and yet they staked their lives to it, and they were willing to be excommunicated from their synagogues and from their families, from their livelihoods in many cases, putting their family, their wives and children in harm's way, and yet they persisted. And something about that whole confluence of different information streams hit me all at once, and I just hit my knees. I was done. I could not unsee that at that moment. The veracity of the resurrection. Now, the rest of the Bible, it took me months to figure out what to do with Leviticus and with Noah's Ark and with, the virgin birth. You mentioned the virgin birth with the book of Revelation. But once the resurrection became clear for me, and I believed it was far more plausible than not that Jesus Christ walked out of his tomb on the third day, everything else I could begin to interpret through that lens. Through the lens of the resurrected Jesus, everything else about Jesus makes sense. Everything else about Paul makes sense. Everything else about the Old Testament makes sense. All of it makes sense if Jesus promised to die and rise, and then he did it. I can trust him about everything else. And so it was a slow process, but this is why, if you're watching, this is why this conversation matters so much, because the resurrection is the lens through which we view everything else. And when we choose to see what is true, and where the evidence leads, everything can change from there. And that's what happened to me. I know you've talked to people over the years. You've experienced the power of the resurrection too. And I just want people to know it's often the first domino of many to fall.
Amen. I'm with you. I love that story, Eric.
I got carried away.
That's awesome. Love it.
I usually just ask questions. I started preaching.
And you've got a great voice, too. You're pleasant to listen to.
Thank you. Sometimes I worry I put people to sleep. Okay, this is great. Let's finish by I'm going to challenge you here and ask you to speak directly to the person who's unconvinced. The well-meaning skeptic who's stuck with us this long, so we know they're at least authentically curious about conversations like these. What piece of evidence, if there's one piece of evidence or one firm question you think they should really seriously consider, what would it be, the one thing that you'd want to put before them if they're still unconvinced about the resurrection?
I'd say look at Paul. Look at Paul. I think, some evidence is stronger than others, right?
Yeah.
And Paul is the ace in our hand, because he wasn't a biased Christian when he said he saw Jesus. He was out persecuting the church. And then he had this experience he was convinced was the risen Jesus, and it turned his life upside down, and he went from persecutor to persecuted and ended up dying as a martyr. He was so convinced of this. Yeah. So that's pretty interesting. And then I would say this. It's fine to ask questions. It's fine to probe and to push back. I do it. But if the tendency, if you're going to, the degree of skepticism and the criteria that you put forward for in order to accept that Jesus rose from the dead, apply that same burden of proof to your own worldview and see how it comes out. Don't let it just be a one-sided thing. Be consistent and say, okay, if I'm going to be that hesitant to accept the resurrection of Jesus, what about my own worldview? Because if you're a skeptic, you got to explain, how did the universe come into existence out of nothing?
Yeah.
Why does it appear, strong appearance, that it was laid out with life in mind and that it was designed. What do you do with human consciousness in the naturalistic evolutionary process? What do you do? How did consciousness arise? I mean, this is something that even atheist philosophers of mind are willing to say, we really don't have any answers for that.
Yep.
But it makes sense if we are created in the image of God. So, I mean, just look at some things like that. How did the universe happen?
Morality?
Morality.
Objective morality and truth, yeah.
I find that very convincing. Some people don't, because it's hard to say that morals are objective. In other words, it's hard to prove morals are objective, but we certainly live as though they are.
That's right.
And I agree with you. I love the moral argument for God's existence. So, does your worldview hold up?
Yeah. That's great. I encourage people all the time, like, doubt religion, doubt me, doubt the Bible, but also doubt your doubts. Like, doubt yourself. Like, put yourself up to the same level of scrutiny. I really appreciate that approach. Anybody that's watching and listening now, again, I want to mention risenjesus.com. What kinds of resources and help would somebody find if they went to risenjesus.com?
Well, they're going to find a number of articles that I've written. They're going to find links to videos. They'll link to my YouTube channel. I have nearly 1,000 videos on our YouTube channel now. So you could go there, check out some of the playlists if you're looking for a particular kind to answer a particular question. So yeah, check out that.
Yeah.
If you're really interested in learning apologetics, check out where I teach at Houston Christian University, hc.edu/defend. And we have certificate programs and an MA in Christian apologetics there.
Yeah, right up the street from us here in Houston, Texas. Even though you're all the way on the eastern coast there and near Atlanta, you teach here at HCU, formerly Houston Baptist University, and they do great work there. And so I hope everybody watching will check out more of Mike's content online, and it will be worth your while. Dr. Mike Licona, thank you so much for joining us on Maybe God. I'd love to have you back sometime, maybe even in person. If you're ever in Houston, we'd love to have you stop by in person.
I'd love to do that, Eric. Really good to meet you, brother, and thanks for having me on.
You blew my mind today, start to finish, Shroud of Turin, all the way through. And I'm so grateful, and we'll talk soon, okay?
Appreciate you, brother.
God bless you.